Are we not living in stressful times right now? This is a stressful situation we are in, of course, but wasn't even planning on referring to having to go through the simplicities, or we would think so when it comes to broadcasting, but have we been able, in general, to cope for the most part with everything that's happening? Has our faith and beliefs been put to the test in how we live our lives? And in general, that is pretty obvious anyway, and we hear about these things, but I'm referring to those specifically in the church. Have our beliefs been questioned? How do we control ourselves and have a presence of mind, which is the ability to remain calm, but at the same time take a quick, sensible action? Being prepared is also vital, and there is a time to speak when need be. Now, we have witnessed all around us, or perhaps even been caught up in it, as victims, or even reciprocated in kind, by being quick to respond, quick to raise the fist, seeking revenge, quick to anger, losing control of our emotions, giving in to sin, not thinking before we act, acting on assumption rather than actuality. And it is easy to allow ourselves to get caught up in all of this, especially if something is said about us which happens to be untrue, or if something happens when we are absolutely certain that it is not the case, but the other side thinks otherwise. Also, when there are disagreements, when we are put on the spot for our mistakes or even our beliefs, when we are questioned by the things we do, when we are accused of having done something that others may not like, whether it be right or wrong. This is common. This happens a lot. And especially those of us in the church, those of us who have been called out to God's way of life. So we can expect these kind of scenarios to take place. The ultimate question being, though, how do we respond? When we respond in the ways I have just described, we lack self-control, which often leads to an outcome of negative consequences. However, by taking control of our actions in the way we respond requires composure or a presence of mind. Now, if we look at athletes, for example, their self-control is often tested when they are whistled for committing a foul, whether it was right or wrong. Especially when it starts going later on into the playoff season in certain sports, then the tendencies are really heightened. The drama really kicks in of how much acting is put into play when there's a foul or whatever it may be. So a player gets upset and starts complaining, thereby losing their composure. And if they go too far, they can get penalized, possibly even ejected, which is a result then which affects the whole team. So instead they get angry and not thinking about their team, they think about themselves and lose their composure. Playing upset oftentimes leads to foolish play. The coach is the one who should hold the most composure, is also the one that has the most stress, because since they are the ones that the players listen to. Now, what's interesting, my son, as I'm sure as many parents out there, have children that play in sports teams, and my son is doing that with soccer. And when I watch him play, the kids out there are having a good time. And when there's a foul or something that's being called against them, they don't complain. You don't really see that much at all. They just go on doing what they're doing. It's the coaches and the parents on the sidelines, however, that talk the most, that yell the most, especially when there's a foul, there should have been something. So it is really interesting how God actually puts that as an example as how we are to be children, being humble. And it's actually a really good lesson. Now, if we all as adults actually did that, there would be a lot less drama when it comes to sports, a lot more control. But we are supposed to be peacemakers, having self-control. And we can't let ourselves fall apart, but need to stay intact when we are faced with adversity. Now, there is one prime example in the Bible, and this is something I have mentioned several times before in past messages, so it may seem like repetition here. But you know what? This is exactly why we need to repeat this, because we are supposed to be imitating this very individual. Somebody who was constantly tested by how he would respond. We read about in John chapter 8, verses 3 to 8. And that individual, if you haven't guessed by now, is Jesus Christ. And as I mentioned in the last message, this was something where constantly being put to the test, and he was causing offense for someone who had never sinned. But how did this affect the general public? If we look at John chapter 8 and verse 3, hold on. The scribes and the Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned, but what do you say?" And they were doing this because they tested him, verse 6, that they might have something to which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger as though he did not hear. So when they continued asking him, see, notice he let it go the first time because he knew what was going to happen if he was going to respond to them right away. So he ignored it. And just like when we're in a situation like that, but if we are constantly being bombarded and constantly being put to the test, there is a time where we need to speak up. Verse 7, when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Obviously, as we know, the rest of the story, no one did that because they were all guilty of sin in some way or another. Now, another example, especially when violence is in the forefront, in Matthew chapter 26 and in verse 50, these are all well-known scriptures that we read here, but they are also very important, and we hear about these all the time. Why is that? Matthew chapter 26 and verse 50. Jesus said to him, "Friend, why have you come?" Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and took him. Suddenly one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. No, notice Jesus' response, saying to him, "Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish or die by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels?" Now, obviously, he didn't do that because there was a purpose. Verse 54, how then could the scriptures be fulfilled? That it must happen thus. Christ was always in good hands. Christ, like he was saying here, could have snapped his fingers, and all these legions of angels God would have provided, but there was obviously a reason behind this. But knowing this, that what God could do for his son, why couldn't he do the same for us and protect us in any scenario that we are in where we need him? Notice also in chapter 27, while he was being crucified, while he was on the stake, chapter 27, verse 39 of Matthew, "And those who passed by blasphemed him, wagging their heads and saying, 'You who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross.' Likewise the chief priests, also mocking with the scribes and elders, said, 'He saved others, himself he cannot save. If he is the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe him.'" Verse 43, "He trusted in God, let him deliver him now if he will have him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.' And even the robbers who were crucified with him reviled him with the same thing." So even all the way up until his death, Jesus Christ was being persecuted, was being tested. However, his response in all of this is noted in Luke 23 and verse 34. Luke 23, verse 34. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." But ultimately, they will know what they did, because they will have repented for what they did. So obviously, in the world we live in today, they're not called out. They don't know what they're doing. A time will come when that will all change. But even through this example of Christ, we are to imitate him, as I said. He had a great presence of mind when being accused many times, when being put on the spot. And he managed to, with all the pressures he was faced with and the demands of the ministry, he was able to maintain his composure to do the will of his Father. Now, are we not supposed to do the same? We have the gift of the Holy Spirit within us to help us, and it is through God's grace in our lives that enables us to respond to the pressures of life with the same presence of mind that Jesus responded in similar situations. And as Christ walked through the storms of life, keeping his composure, we are to do the same. That is what God expects of us. That we are to conduct ourselves both inwardly and outwardly with the same character and grace that Jesus did when he was on this earth. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, we read, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin." He shares his compassion with us because he had experienced the same trials, the same temptations that we go through. And the next verse tells us what we are supposed to do, what we will achieve when we apply ourselves in the correct manner. Verse 16, "Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." So let us go back to how we are to respond when we are in a sudden situation, when we are perhaps put on the spot. How do we remain calm? To be a good leader, you need to have self-control. This also applies to being a good teacher, also applies to being good parents, and also applies to being good listeners. We all have the same future to look forward to, because that day is going to come when we are all going to be teachers, and when we will teach the whole world God's way of life, having a solid presence of mind as a valuable tool. We cannot lose ourselves when something is said that we don't like or agree with, when we are criticized, when something happens that is out of our control, let's say. What we have to do as the scriptures tell us how we are to act in James chapter 1 in verse 19 and 20. James chapter 1 and verse 19. These are, as the heading says, are qualities needed in trials. "So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Now, by applying the grace of God in our lives, a valuable tool that we should never be without, and can most certainly help in any given situation, just like when services begins and we have an opening prayer, and as we have heard in the opening prayer, what are we praying about right now? We can apply prayer at any time, at any moment, in any environment, whenever we need help. It can be for the simplest things, like I'm being put on the spot right now, so how do I respond? We're having broadcasting problems. How do we fix this? A simple prayer. So instead of seeking to respond in a way which is typically our initial reaction, let's try another approach, that of composure, self-control, a firm presence of mind, where we can be in control of ourselves. And never forget that we can always seek God to help us in any given situation by keeping us strong and of a sound mind.